Alright, before we begin, like the video, subscribe, and tell me in the comments what kind of stories you want next. The air in the cab of the aging four-wheel drive utility vehicle smelled of stale coffee, damp wool, and the faint metallic tang of unspent anxiety. Jack Turner had inhaled far worse things over the years: acid runoff, rotting carrion after a summer flood, the distinctive sickly sweet odor of smoldering house fire. But this particular scent cocktail, blended with the rich, earthy perfume of the mountain forest, felt sharp and corrosive. This was the smell of a job that paid too well for its inherent risk. It was the smell of being bought. He pulled the rig onto the gravel shoulder and killed the engine. The resulting silence was immediate and profound. A heavy blanket pulled over the world, broken only by the rapid ticking of the cooling manifold. They traveled approximately 100 miles past the last serious sign of civilization, a gas station and bait shop that had survived on grit and good intentions since the Eisenhower administration. Now they were deep in the territory known only by the old-timers as the Wash, a vast tract of timberland commercially stripped 20 years earlier and left for the maples and alders to reclaim. The old logging roads, which Jack knew better than his own reflection, had dissolved back into the moss and damp needles. "End of the line, gentlemen," Jack announced, turning to look at the group huddled in the back. "From here, it is Shank's mare and good luck. The truck will not handle the deadfall past that last switchback." The group of 5 was arrayed like 5 pieces of the same machine. Their leader, Grant, sat in the middle, radiating an icy neutrality that chilled Jack. Grant was lean and built like a fence post, dressed in expensive, practical outdoor gear that clearly had never touched mud. The other 4 were just as unnerving. They moved only when necessary, their expressions as blank as paper plates. Jack had guided high-strung corporate executives, paranoid survivalists, and hapless tourists, but he had never encountered a group so utterly devoid of personality. They had asked nothing about the history of the mountains, offered no comment on the beauty of the old growth, and had not once complained about the biting chill that still clung to the shadows even in late spring. "Understood, Mr. Turner," Grant replied. His voice was flat, without inflection, the kind of voice used for giving directions over an intercom. "We proceed on foot. You remain certain of the path to the quarry?" "I could walk that path blindfolded," Jack assured him, though the assurance tasted like sawdust. "But I told you, Grant, that quarry is dead. It has been abandoned since the late 60s. No extraction, nothing but limestone and bats." Grant simply nodded, acknowledging the data without processing the implication. They moved with dreadful, rehearsed efficiency. When they swung their packs out, the movements were synchronized. When they stepped onto the forest floor, their boots found the same muffled spot, minimizing any crunching noise. They did not stumble, did not sigh, and did not exchange glances. They simply existed in a state of unnatural readiness. As they began the hike, moving deeper into the tangle of thorn bushes and thick, rotting cedar logs, the familiar smell of the damp forest intensified, a powerful cocktail of pine sap, wet earth, and mushroom rot. It should have been comforting, the smell of the wilderness he knew. But today, it felt tainted. That night they chose a small, sheltered depression between 3 massive boulders. Jack started to pull out his small folding shovel, preparing to dig a fire pit, but Grant stopped him with a single raised hand. "No fire!" Grant stated. "The risk is too great. Residual heat. We maintain a low profile." Jack knew the fire risk logic was false. It had rained heavily just 2 days prior. The ground was saturated. The excuse was a lie, and Jack felt the familiar, cold knot of professional caution tighten in his gut. They ate their rations. Jack had a thermos of tepid coffee and a thick sandwich he had made that morning. The others chewed on small gray briquettes that resembled compressed packing material. They did not drink water from the nearby trickle, relying instead on sealed flasks they carried. Jack pretended to settle down, pulling his sleeping bag out and arranging his ground cloth. He knew he would not sleep well. A constant, low-frequency hum permeated the air, a sound identical to high-tension power lines, though the nearest power grid was miles away. It was subtle, masked by the natural night noises, but insistent. And there was that other smell, faint yet persistent, a sharp, clean odor like ozone and overheated metal, the kind of scent left behind after a powerful electrical short. It was not the smell of nature. It was the smell of industry, misplaced and deeply wrong. He slept on top of his bag, fully clothed, his heavy-duty knife tucked into his waistband. Every shadow seemed deeper. Every rustle of dry leaves sounded too loud, too calculated. He was a creature of the wild, trained to differentiate a deer's browsing from a coyote's stalk, but these sounds were alien. Small, dry shifts, too quick, too efficient. Dawn was gray and cold. Jack pulled out his handheld radio to check the emergency bands. Standard procedure. Dead air. Not static, not a fading signal, but a total, unnerving vacuum. He flipped on the Global Positioning System unit next. The map loaded fine. The contours of the mountain range stark and familiar. But his coordinates were dancing, jumping 20 miles north, then instantly 50 miles west, pointing to places that were mathematically impossible, over the Pacific Ocean or the next state line. He pocketed the gear, forcing a calm breath. He rationalized the event as a geomagnetic anomaly caused by iron deposits, a common occurrence in old mining regions. It was the only logical answer, but the reality of the forest made logic feel flimsy, like tissue paper in a downpour. They started moving again deeper into the tangled undergrowth. Jack, walking point, found himself on an old game trail, probably used by elk. A few hundred feet later, right where the trail crossed a damp, mossy patch, he saw it. An imprint. The print was not from a bear. Those were broad, splayed, and usually left deep gouges from the claws. This impression was massive, easily twice the size of Jack's size 12 boot, and shaped with a rigid, terrible symmetry. It was too long for a foot, too flat, lacking the distinct pad structure of a natural paw. It was the clear impression of a foot encased in rigid, heavy leather. What chilled Jack to the bone was not the size, however. It was the repetition. Every 50 feet or so, where the ground was soft enough, he saw the print. A single print. Never a left, never a right, just one colossal, perfectly formed impact. He knelt, pretending to adjust his gaiter, and touched the packed earth inside the mark. It was old, certainly, maybe weeks, but the rigidity of the impression suggested tremendous weight and deliberate placement. It was a footfall designed not to walk, but to patrol. Jack stood up, brushing the dirt from his glove, and glanced back at Grant, who was watching him with those dead eyes. Jack felt a fresh wave of dread, sharp as a sliver of glass, pierce his chest. He realized he was guiding this cold, silent efficiency straight toward whatever left that mark. He knew with terrible certainty that he was not the guide. He was the delivery service. The transition was abrupt, like walking from a crowded room into a soundproof chamber. 1 minute they were navigating a thicket of second-growth pine, where the wind made the needles whisper and the chipmunks chattered their protests. The next, they stepped out onto a wide, flat stretch, a valley floor devastated by an old, colossal wildfire, and the world fell silent. The soil here was dark, powdery, and smelled faintly of charcoal and ancient ash. Yet the silence was not caused by the environmental damage. It was systemic. Jack stopped, raising his hand. Grant, right behind him, stopped instantly, without touching the guide. Jack listened, his senses tuned to the baseline noise of the wilderness, the high-pitched hum of mosquitoes, the distant cry of a hawk, the subtle, constant thrum of life happening under the canopy. Nothing. Not a bird call, not the sawing rasp of a cricket, not the buzzing drone of a fly. It was a silence so complete, so pervasive, that it exerted a physical pressure on the eardrums. It felt unnatural, like a vacuum, sucking the noise right out of the atmosphere. Why the pause, Turner? Grant's voice, though low, sounded obscenely loud in the stillness. The sound, Jack murmured, gesturing vaguely at the scorched earth around them. It is dead quiet. Even after a fire, the bugs return quickly. You should hear the wind at least. We are deep in a low-traffic depression, Grant stated, the explanation thin and clinical. Microclimates affect acoustic output. Jack let it go. Arguing with Grant was arguing with a stone. He stepped out onto the black earth. It was surprisingly firm underfoot, packed hard by years of rain and sun. But occasionally his boot broke through into soft, yielding ash. They pushed deeper into the valley, following the meandering course of a seasonal stream bed that was currently dry. About half a mile in, they found the camp. It was nestled beneath an overhang of fractured basalt, a small, sad collection of shredded nylon and snapped tent poles. Jack recognized the vintage immediately. Standard high-altitude gear, good quality, used by serious hikers or geological surveyors. There was no blood, no visible sign of a struggle, no overturned pots or hastily abandoned campfires. The site was too neat, yet fundamentally destroyed. The tents had been opened with surgical precision, sliced along the seams by an invisible razor that peeled the fabric back. Jack moved closer, his breath hitched in his throat. He saw scraps of brightly colored plastic, water bottle fragments, the remains of cheap packaging, all neatly chewed, stripped of any label or identifying mark, and then spat out, dry and chalky. The material had been taste-tested and rejected. "Bear activity," Grant said, his voice reaching Jack from behind. "No, Grant. Bears thrash. They leave claw marks, they leave scat, they leave blood. They take the food and leave the mess. This is a search pattern, a clean extraction." Jack pointed to a small, neatly coiled piece of climbing rope. They did not take anything organic. They only took what mattered: data, supplies, human elements. Everything else was filed down to inert waste. He felt a deep chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. Whatever had visited this camp had not been hungry. It had been selective. It was terrifyingly efficient. They continued their silent trek. Jack noticed the odd habits of the group more closely now. They did not sweat, despite the hard walking. They did not complain. When they paused, they silently pulled out their gray briquettes and chewed them with an unnerving slowness. They were not fueling their bodies, They were maintaining them like a machine being periodically lubricated. They possessed function, but zero appetite or enjoyment. That night, the lack of sound was even more pronounced. The air pressure fluctuated wildly, and the low, distant hum Jack had heard the night before was closer, resonating deep in his chest cavity. The ground itself vibrated at a frequency too low for normal human hearing to register, but loud enough to rattle the fillings in his teeth. Jack was drifting near the edge of sleep, trying to force his mind blank when the sensation hit him. It was not a sound or a sight. It was the feeling of proximity, a sudden, overwhelming warmth directly behind his head. It was not the heat of a fire, which smelled of smoke, but a dry, sterile warmth, like a heat lamp. He did not smell breath, no mint, no coffee, no animal musk, nothing. Just heat and a quiet, weightless pressure. The hairs on the back of his neck prickled, and his heart slammed against his ribs. Every muscle in his body tightened, screaming at him to explode into motion. He did not think, he reacted. He rolled violently, knife already drawn, swinging it in a wide, desperate arc. The blade sliced nothing but the cold night air. The spot where the warmth had been was empty. The perimeter of the clearing was defined by a dense, unyielding wall of black spruce trees, their shadows merging into an impenetrable screen. He held his breath for a long minute, waiting for the counterattack, the rush, the snarl. But there was only the cold, pervasive silence, interrupted only by his own ragged breathing and the painful, throbbing thrum in his ears. Whatever had been there had vanished, not by running, but by simple, instantaneous non-existence. He stayed awake the rest of the night, staring into the dark, his mind racing. Something had been close enough to breathe on him, but it was clever enough to leave absolutely no trace. When the first sickly gray light of dawn crept over the ridge, Jack felt utterly spent. His energy drained not by physical exertion, but by pure psychological warfare. He sat up. The others were already packed, their silhouettes standing like dark statues. He counted automatically. Grant, +3. "Where is Sam?" Jack asked, his voice rough. One of the four, a man named Fiss, simply gestured with his chin toward a small nylon backpack lying neatly on the ground 10 feet away. It was Sam's pack. Empty, except for a few insignificant scraps of paper and a broken plastic compass. Grant walked over, picked up the pack, and tossed it into the deep shadows beneath the basalt overhang without a flicker of emotion. "-1, Grant said, his voice flat. He did not look for Sam, did not call his name, did not even pause. Expected attrition. "We move." Jack felt the panic recede, replaced by a cold, crystalline fury that sharpened his vision and calmed his shaking hands. They knew. They expected it. Sam had not run, had not been killed in a struggle. He had simply been removed, an unnecessary component shed by the structure. Jack was no longer dealing with men or even animals. He was dealing with a process, something infinitely more terrifying than a monster with claws. He took a deep breath of the sterile, silent air, gripped the straps of his own pack, and followed. He knew he had to understand where they were going and what function he was meant to fulfill before he too was tossed aside like an empty pack. They were moving too fast. Jack, despite his years of training and superior knowledge of the terrain, struggled to keep pace with the unnaturally smooth, ground-eating strides of Grant and the 3 remaining silent companions. His body screamed in protest. Their bodies seemed to operate on different metrics, oblivious to fatigue or pain. They had pushed out of the dead valley and were now climbing a steep, rocky slope that Jack remembered being gentle and accessible. He had traversed this ridge 5 years ago, guiding a party of surveyors looking for mineral rights. It had been hard hiking but predictable. Now the mountain had rearranged itself. He stopped, pressing his hand against the cold, rough face of a nearly vertical incline. The path they had taken yesterday, which should have angled around this face, was gone. Instead, there was a fresh, raw scar in the earth, a massive debris slide that had sheared away tons of rock and soil, exposing creamy white limestone veins streaked with gray. The cut smelled sharply of mineral dust and sulfur, a dizzying, acrid odor that was not the natural decay of the mountainside, but the stench of violent recent trauma. "The trail is gone," Jack choked out, catching his breath. Grant was already scaling the sheer face, not climbing in the traditional sense, but adhering to the rock, his body low and his movements precise. "The environment adapts to necessity," Grant called down, his voice utterly devoid of strain. "Obstruction removal is optimal." Jack did not know how the debris slide could be recent. There had been no major storm or earthquake. But looking at the unnerving efficiency of the scar, it seemed less like an accident and more like a deliberate reconfiguration designed to funnel them toward a single point. During a brief pause near the ridgeline while the others waited, standing stiffly against the cold wind, Jack watched Grant closely. He had the opportunity for detailed observation, and what he saw chilled him to the core, dissolving the last vestiges of his belief in familiar horror tropes. Grant was not angry, not exerting himself. He was merely waiting, breathing deeply and slowly. Yet Jack saw the subtle, sickening shift begin. It was not a sudden, monstrous transformation born of rage. It was a structural realignment, quiet and inevitable. Grant's skin, where it was visible above his collar, was losing its human coloration, becoming flat, lifeless gray, like dried clay. The change was most pronounced on his face, the underlying bone structure subtly elongated, pushing the skin taut over the brow and jawline. His cheekbones jutted slightly forward, creating shadows where there should be smooth curves. His eyes, already too dark, were undergoing a terrifying shift. The pupils expanded, consuming the faint hint of iris, becoming perfectly black, absorbent discs that did not reflect the pale daylight but seemed to drink it in. This was a functional change. A system was upgrading itself for better performance in low visibility. There was no beast here, no raging primal force, just cold biological engineering. The realization hit Jack with the force of a physical blow. These were not the shapeshifters of campfire tales. There was no fur, no slavering jaws, no desperate plea for lost control. Their movements were terrifyingly calculated. When they resumed the descent on the opposite side of the ridge, a treacherous slope of loose scree, their elbows and knees bent and locked at angles that would shatter a human joint, allowing them to traverse the near-vertical rock face with a smooth, terrifying glide. They used the landscape rather than fought it. Night found them sheltered in a shallow, damp cave, the air smelling of ancient dust and iron pyrit. Jack was exhausted, but sleep was impossible. The low-frequency roiling sound from underground was back, closer and far louder, no longer just a hum, but a deep, churning throb. It sounded exactly like a colossal industrial complex, buried deep beneath the earth, its ventilation shafts pushing out a rhythmic, subterranean roar, Whoosh, thrum, whoosh, thrum. The noise was so loud, yet so low on the frequency spectrum, that it bypassed his ears and resonated directly in his skull, shaking his sense of equilibrium. He stared into the absolute darkness, his mind beginning to fray at the edges, terrified that the structural change he had witnessed in Grant was now being forced upon the very ground they stood on. He heard a soft movement and twisted around, his knife finally out of the sheath. Grant was standing in the mouth of the cave, silhouetted against the weak moonlight. "You are deteriorating, Turner," Grant noted, his dark eyes fixed on Jack. "What the hell are you?" Jack whispered, his voice trembling. "What happened to Sam? Why did you make this climb?" Grant stepped closer, his elongated face barely visible in the dark. But the efficiency of his form was palpable. Sam failed to integrate. He was excess. And the climb was necessary because the lower roads were inefficient. "This is not about efficiency, Grant. This is insane." Grant paused, then spoke, his voice sounding dry and brittle, like the rustling of dead leaves over pavement. "Insanity is subjective. You view this through a lens of human weakness. We operate on necessity." He took another step, closing the distance Jack desperately needed. "We are not a pack, Turner. Packs scatter, packs hunt for sustenance. Packs are ruled by instinct and emotion. Packs break. We are a structure, an army. And every structure requires components. You have proven yourself resilient, adaptive, and highly self-sufficient." Grant tilted his head, a movement that was disconcertingly inhuman. "You have arrived at the final node. You must now understand your function within the structure. That is the only thing that matters now." The subterranean roar intensified, and Jack felt the cold certainty that he was not just facing a horror, but a terrible, overwhelming order. The terror was no longer the fear of being devoured. The terror was the fear of being utilized. The fear Jack felt in that damp cave was corrosive, yet it was tempered by a strange, sharp clarity. Grant's words had sliced through the fog of supernatural dread and exposed a terrifying mechanism underneath. This was not a curse, but an evolution, a functional adaptation. They had not been chosen for strength or speed, but for efficiency and discipline. They did not want his blood, they wanted his skill set. "You are looking for a soldier," Jack managed to rasp, sheathing his knife with a shaky hand. "We are looking for an operator," Grant corrected, still standing between Jack and the cave mouth. "A sentry. A coordinator. Your previous specialization was resource management and retrieval in extreme stress scenarios. That is a highly valued trait. Human fear and weakness are inefficient. They are culled." The cold pragmatism was staggering. Jack realized his entire journey had been an elaborate, high-stakes personality test. His knowledge of the mountains, his ability to keep calm under stress, his ingrained habit of assessing risk and finding the most logical solution. All of it had been data points for the army. Jack feigned submission, waiting for an opportunity. When Grant turned his elongated head slightly, tracking the sound of the underground thrum, Jack bolted. He ran deeper into the mountain, scrambling through a narrow fracture in the cave wall that opened into an old, disused mining shaft. It was dark, slick with moisture, and smelled strongly of iron and stagnant water. He moved like a specter, relying on his tactile memory of dark spaces, navigating the slippery rock face and crumbling timber supports. He found a small side tunnel, barely wide enough for his shoulders, and burrowed into it. kicking loose debris behind him to obscure his entrance. He stopped, holding his breath, listening for the panicked shouts or the heavy, clumsy footfalls of pursuit. The pursuit never came. Instead, a dry voice spoke from right outside the shaft, startling him so badly he nearly dropped his headlamp. The logical conclusion for a subject utilizing high-stress evasion training would be the low-probability ingress point, assuming the pursuer lacks fine motor sensory input, Grant stated, the words echoing cleanly off the rock. We anticipated the lateral evasion, wasteful deployment. Jack pressed himself against the damp rock. They had calculated his decision based on his own established patterns of behavior. They had read his plan before he had even fully formulated it. A pale, gray hand reached into the side shaft, holding a beam of focused white light. It did not point the light at Jack. It simply held it steady, an invitation devoid of threat. Come out, operator. The test phase is over. Integration is mandatory for continued system function. Defeated, Jack crawled back out. Grant led him deeper into the system, past the main shaft, and into a wider, naturally occurring cavern. This was where the true horror resided, not in the shape of the living, but in the shape of the discarded. Lining the walls of the cavern, covered in a thin, chalky layer that resembled mineral deposits or dried lime, were bodies. Dozens of them. They were not skeletons. They were husks, individuals frozen mid-movement. A woman bent over, shielding her head. A man reaching out, his mouth open in a silent cry. They were caught in half-form, not fully human, but not fully transitioned into the rigid, efficient shape of Grant and his companions. Their skin was taut and calcified, their eyes empty sockets in the plaster-like faces. These were those who failed the adaptation, Grant explained, sweeping his light over the dreadful tableau. They could not rationalize the change. Their minds rejected the new imperative, becoming inert. They did not survive the shift, and their biomass became part of the structure's foundation. Jack finally understood the deeper existential terror. These were not victims of violence. They were victims of failed consciousness. They had died because their human minds could not accept the terrible, cold logic of survival at any cost. Grant then began to explain their mission, speaking in the detached tones of an engineer reviewing schematics. The threat we monitor is not human, nor is it subject to human laws of physics or biology. It is an intrusion from a state of existence adjacent to our own. It is held back by the high geological density of this mountain range, specifically the granite and limestone deposits, which act as a filter. Grant pointed up at the rough ceiling, where thin veins of black, dense material pulsed faintly in the gloom. We are the maintenance crew. The boundary requires constant vigilance. If the border fails, the intrusion will leak, and what it does to our environment is highly detrimental to all life forms, including yours. They did not seek to eliminate people. They sought to eliminate the external threat and, secondarily, eliminate the chaos that humans brought to the border zones. You see our purpose, Turner, Grant finished. We are the necessary compromise. We trade humanity for longevity. We sacrifice comfort and moral context for absolute containment. In the face of ultimate chaos, absolute, organized function is the purest form of good. Jack stood there, numb, the heavy underground thrum pressing down on him. The sheer chilling logic of it was undeniable. He had spent his life valuing efficiency, recognizing the critical importance of keeping systems operational, and facing ugly truths head-on in his search and rescue work. He looked at the petrified remains of those who could not cope with the truth. They had preferred the lie of human normalcy to the horror of function. For the first time, Jack felt his own ingrained sense of rationality turning against him. He saw the cold, unshakable meaning in Grant's actions. The army was terrible, but it made perfect, undeniable sense. The thought did not breed resistance. It bred a dreadful acceptance. The final leg of the journey was entirely vertical. Grant led them down into the belly of the earth, following the main fault line that had once served as the central excavation site for the abandoned quarry. The light grew weaker, filtering down through cracks high above, turning the surrounding basalt and shale a sickly, luminous green. The air quality shifted drastically. It was heavy, saturated with moisture, thick with a complex odor that assaulted Jack's senses. It was the smell of fermentation and decay, overlaid with something sharper, the metallic stench of iron and the unmistakable cloying sweetness of extremely dead water trapped for millennia in underground reservoirs. The sounds were different, too. The industrial thrum was no longer a distant resonance. It was the immediate atmosphere. It felt like walking inside a giant, slow-beating heart. They descended into the hive. It was not a lair or a den, but a colossal subterranean amphitheater carved out by ancient geology. And Jack suspected generations of directed labor. The main cavern floor was hundreds of feet below the rim, a dizzying drop that made Jack's stomach clench. The stone walls were streaked with thick, black, fibrous growth, a dense mycelium that thrived on the mineral-rich darkness, binding the limestone and rock together. It gave the space a terrifying, organic feel, as if the mountain itself were infected. The floor of the hive was indeed a hive. Hundreds of figures moved within the vast space, all in various stages of the cold transformation Jack had observed in Grant. Some were fully rigid, gray, and efficient, carrying out tasks with silent, robotic dedication, shaping rock, reinforcing beams, or simply standing watch. Others were in transition, their movements slightly slower, their forms still recognizably human in places, but rapidly being overridden by the rigid, functional architecture. The movement was silent. No chit-chat, no grunts of effort, no sounds of machinery, only the low, pervasive thrumming that resonated through the rock and the slick shuffle of dozens of feet moving across the damp floor. Jack felt violently foreign. His warm, soft human body, his uneven, panicked heartbeat, the smell of his own sweat and fear, his uncontrollable racing thoughts. All of it felt like static, a chaotic anomaly in this environment of cold, perfect resonance. He was disruptive. Grant led him to a dry, elevated section of the cavern, where several figures were clustered around a huge slab of polished slate. This was the operations center. On the slate, etched with precision and deep skill, were maps. Not modern topographical surveys, but intricate three-dimensional renderings of the mountains, showing layers of sedimentary rock, fault lines, and, most ominously, a complex network of ancient tunnels running deep beneath the regional geography. The etchings looked centuries old, layered and refined by multiple hands. The tunnels, Jack realized, led straight out into the valleys and settlements beyond the mountains. They were potential ingress points. Every single one of them was marked with a tiny, precise symbol, indicating that it had been methodically, thoroughly sealed. Generations of work, Grant confirmed, seeing where Jack's attention lay. Every breach must be contained. Every weakness must be eliminated. The sight of the maps, coupled with the silent, vast scope of the operation, drove the final nail into Jack's remaining human resistance. This was not a temporary gathering or a local monster problem. This was a dedicated, multi-century military establishment, fighting an endless, unseen war. Grant pointed to an unsealed section of the tunnel system, labeled with angular, unsettling symbols. This is our current primary focus. An anomaly has been detected, which brings us to you. Jack swallowed, his throat dry. The high-paying job, the route, my presence. It was not about the money, Grant said, dismissing the concept of currency with the wave of a gray hand. The money was bait, a common human motivator. It was about observation. Your reaction to the dead sound, your attention to the structural damage on the trail, your professional distance when Sam was removed, your immediate, logical flight into the side shaft. All data points. Jack felt a wave of nausea, realizing he had been performing for a silent, inhuman audience since the moment he shook Grant's hand. It was a multifactorial assessment, Grant clarified. We tested your ability to survive the terrain, adapt to unforeseen dangers, and most importantly, process the necessary reality when the rules changed. You demonstrated high competence. Jack closed his eyes, the image of the petrified forms on the wall flashing in his mind. He had not been kidnapped. He had been vetted. His skills, which he had honed through years of self-reliance and harrowing rescues, were exactly what the Army required. We need operators who can function under duress, who understand isolation, and who are not hampered by external attachments, Grant said. You came here alone. You leave nothing behind. And you are willing to look into the darkness. Jack opened his eyes. The immense, silent labor of the hive continued around him. He felt the cold truth sink into his bones. He had not been chosen for his innocence. He had been chosen for his internal fissure, the readiness to accept that sometimes the only way to save the world is to become something that the world would fear and despise. Grant led Jack away from the operations center, deeper still, into a side tunnel where the air was noticeably drier and cooler. The ceiling here was lined with glittering mineral deposits, reflecting the pale light from Grant's lamp. This was the archives. The records were not written, nor were they etched onto parchment. They were installations, macabre tableaus of history preserved by the very forces the Army sought to contain. The first installation was shocking. It was the cross-section of what had once been a small wooden settlement. Timbers, rusted hinges, and fragments of human bone were fused into the limestone wall, perfectly preserved. The figures were caught in acts of terrifying normalcy. A hand reaching for a water bucket, a torso leaning over a work table. The entire settlement had been instantly petrified and then sliced in half, revealing the precise moment of its ending. Grant did not need to speak. The images conveyed a history far more horrific than any text could. This settlement was located on a weak point of the barrier, approximately 400 years ago, Grant explained in his dry, even tone. They lived above the fracture. The intrusion came through too fast for us to respond fully. Grant then placed his cold, gray hand on Jack's temple. The contact was not painful, but the effect was immediate and dizzying. Jack's mind was flooded with a terrifying sensation. Not visual information, but a pure, visceral feeling of overwhelming wrongness. He felt cold, colder than ice, a cold that did not come from temperature but from an absence of energy. He sensed something vast and empty, something that traveled not through space but through the momentary failure of space. When it passed, it left behind a vacuum, a terrible hollowness where light, heat, and sound simply ceased to function. There was no suffering, because suffering required a nervous system capable of responding. It was simply erasure. The sensation lasted only a second, but it left Jack gasping, retching against the wall of the cave, the smell of damp earth and iron suddenly overwhelming. "That is what we guard against," Grant stated, withdrawing his hand. "An existence that does not merely destroy, but unmakes, where even the mercy of annihilation is denied." Jack wiped the bile from his chin, his entire body trembling. He realized the army was not the apex predator. They were the thin, desperate defense against something infinitely worse. "You do not do this for humanity," Jack croaked out, his voice raw. "We do it for territory," Grant confirmed, utterly without shame. "Humanity is ephemeral. This geological structure is constant. It is the only thing capable of containing the intrusion for long periods. If this mountain falls, the containment fails, and then our habitat is eliminated. We are simply ensuring our survival by maintaining the integrity of the barrier." It was the purest, most terrifying form of pragmatism. There was no nobility, no human sentiment, just calculation. Grant then addressed Jack's candidacy again, pointing out the psychological data points. Jack had been a volunteer rescue operative for 10 years. He had pulled bodies from freezing rivers, navigated burning wreckage, and spent weeks isolated in the wilderness tracking lost hikers. He was adept at functioning in the moral gray zone where success was often defined by unavoidable partial failure. "You have an internal fracture, Turner," Grant observed, his black eyes seeming to penetrate Jack's skull. "That incident with the river, the partner you could not pull out. That failure did not break you. It anchored you. It gave you the capacity to accept that sometimes the only outcome is loss, and yet you must still move forward. You understand irreversible damage." The memory of his friend, pulled from the glacial melt, skin blue, eyes open and empty, was Jack's deepest wound. The Army saw that wound not as weakness, but as a qualification. Grant pointed to one of the ancient maps outlining the perimeter. "You have now seen the truth of the outside. You understand what happens when the barrier fails. We do not coerce, but we do not tolerate waste. Your skills are necessary here. Your function is defined." He paused, the heavy thrumming filling the silence. "You choose now, Turner, to accept the necessary burden of service, or to be rendered inert, like the others who could not cross the mental threshold." The offer was clear. Remain human and face erasure, or sacrifice his humanity and join the defense, becoming the cold, terrible thing required to hold the line. The weight of his past failures, his guilt, felt like a physical pressure, pushing him toward the unforgiving yet orderly logic of the Army. The internal struggle was short and violent. Jack suddenly clung fiercely to the remnants of his identity, the sound of his mother's laughter, the memory of driving a beat-up old truck through the morning mist, the simple pleasure of a good hot cup of coffee. He lunged back toward the cave mouth, his body screaming a primal rejection of the cold, functional logic that was being imposed upon him. He ripped his heavy-duty knife from his belt. The blade was 7 inches of honed steel, meant for cutting through harness ropes and thick ice. He spun around, facing Grant and the two figures who had silently materialized behind him. "I will not become one of your statues," Jack snarled, his voice high and thin, echoing in the vast subterranean space. Grant did not flinch. The two other figures, now undeniably in their transitional forms, their bodies long and angular, did not adopt a combat stance. They simply watched, their black, absorbing eyes fixed on Jack with clinical interest. It was the calm assessment of a biologist watching a moth batter itself against a pane of glass. Jack's hand shook so hard the knife blade vibrated. He realized the fight was not about physical supremacy. If he attacked, they would neutralize him instantly without malice, simply removing a chaotic element from the system. He was not afraid of their strength. He was terrified by their indifference, their chilling conviction that they were right. The terrifying realization was that Grant held the moral high ground. His right to exist in this monstrous form was based on an urgent existential necessity that Jack, in his soft, human state, could never fully grasp, let alone resist. The acidic smell of his own fear, sharp, salty, and sour, flooded his nostrils. He closed his eyes again, and the memory of the river rescue came roaring back. He was 15 feet away, the current running like a freight train, his harness line fouled. He heard his friend's final muffled cry for help before the icy water dragged him under the snarl of driftwood. He spent the next 3 days recovering the body. It was a failure that had defined his life, teaching him the absolute finality of things gone wrong. The Army knew this. They had calculated that internal trauma was the most powerful vector for acceptance. Guilt, the crushing certainty that he should have done more, should have been faster, should have been better, was the ultimate mechanism for self-sacrifice. You could not save them then. You can serve now. Grant stepped forward, extending a long gray hand toward the knife Jack held. Your trauma is your strength here, Turner. We do not demand blind faith. We demand functional dedication, proved by your willingness to operate beyond the limits of human sentiment. He did not speak of the consequences of failure outside the barrier. He simply offered Jack the sensory intrusion again, the cold, blinding emptiness that devoured light. Jack did not want the touch, but the image was enough. He saw the area Grant called there beyond. It was not a landscape of rock and earth, but a zone of constant instability, where the very fabric of existence was stressed and warped. Time did not flow normally. It pooled and stuttered. Light was not illuminating. It was painful, fractured into non-colors that scraped against the optic nerve. Nothing that belonged to Jack's world could survive there. The alternative was to be part of the cold, rigid, unfeeling machine that was holding back that ultimate dissolution. Jack's hand dropped. The steel blade hit the floor of the cavern with a soft metallic thud that seemed shockingly loud in the profound quiet. He watched the knife wobble and then settle, reflecting the faint green light. He had not surrendered to physical force. He had succumbed to an awful, inescapable logic. He saw the world he had known, the world of highways, ball games, and cheap beer, as a fragile, foolish theatrical set built on a collapsing foundation. And down here, in the cold, wet dark, the real crew was working, holding the structural supports in place. "I accept," Jack said, his voice flat, emptied of emotion. Grant nodded once, a minimal, efficient motion. "Good. The unit Turner is now designated for immediate integration." The process begins now. The weight of duty, Jack realized, was heavier than any pack, heavier than any physical burden he had ever carried. It was the weight of knowing the truth and willingly destroying himself to serve it. The integration was not a sudden, violent act, but a systematic, pervasive process. It started subtly, almost innocuously, shortly after Jack spoke the words of acceptance. There was no fang, no ritualistic bite. Instead, Grant placed his hand on Jack's shoulder, a single point of contact that felt immediately invasive. Through the thin fabric of Jack's shirt, the coldness of Grant's gray skin was shocking, a temperature that drew the warmth out of Jack's very core. "The change is systemic," Grant explained. "It is administered through atmospheric exposure, metabolic ingestion, and directed contact. It is not an infection. It is a rapid, controlled cellular re-architecture." The first physical sensation was an intense, deep-seated chill. It began in his bones, spreading outward, a paralyzing cold that made his joints ache and his teeth chatter uncontrollably. He felt his blood thicken, becoming sluggish and heavy, moving through his veins like molasses. His human biology was slowing down, being prepared for the metabolic shift. Then came the compression. Jack felt his muscles contract violently, not in spasms of pain, but in powerful, controlled clenches. The familiar softness of his biceps and thighs gave way to an impossible rope-like density. His skin stretched tautly across the new, harder framework, losing its superficial sensitivity. He could still feel touch, but the subtle differences between heat and cold, rough and smooth, began to blur. His new tissues were armor designed to withstand extremes. The sounds were horrifying. A low, grinding, grating noise emanated from his own skeleton as his frame was reshaped. His spine felt like it was being pulled, vertebrae adjusting and fusing to allow for the inhuman flexibility and speed he had observed in Grant. He heard a sharp, wet pop in his knees and felt a wave of dizzying nausea as his legs were functionally redesigned, optimized for climbing sheer surfaces and moving without sound. But the physical distress, though immense, was temporary. The true terror was the mental shift. As his body became colder and denser, his emotional center began to wither. Memories, the touch of a woman's hand, the sharp, happy taste of bourbon, the comfort of an old television show, flashed through his mind, not as precious recollections, but as distracting data points. The deep wells of fear and guilt that had been his defining characteristics began to dry up, replaced by an acute, terrifying clarity. The complexity of human emotion, love, regret, humor, became an intolerable noise, a static that interfered with the primary operating system. He watched, horrified, as his consciousness underwent an immediate, ruthless cleanup. He was not losing his intelligence. He was refining it, stripping away everything that was not immediately relevant to function. His personal history ceased to be him and became merely a record of successful operational metrics. He was no longer Jack Turner. He was a unit. He looked through eyes that were already beginning to cloud over, losing their human color, turning a flat, functional gray. And he saw Grant not as a monstrous leader, but as Function G. He saw himself reflected in the cold, hard efficiency of the Army. His past self was merely the operating system upon which the new, necessary software was being installed. Grant, Function G, began his instruction immediately, relying not on verbal explanation, which was clumsy, but on sensory input. The Army does not speak the language of sound, which is easily compromised, Function G intoned. We communicate through vibration, pheromones, and directed thought patterns. Jack felt a new sensation in the deep structures of his sinuses and inner ear. A subtle, rhythmic pulsing that he instinctively understood was a communication network. He did not hear a sound, but he felt the information being passed. The disposition of the patrol in the northern sectors, the pressure readings at the deepest point of the barrier, the status of the maintenance teams. He learned the language of scent. The smell of damp pine needles now carried a warning about air quality. The metallic tang of certain minerals indicated the presence of fresh erosion. The faint, sickly sweet odor of human fear meant a trespasser was close. He was absorbing a universe of data that had been invisible to him just hours before. When Function G stepped back, Jack stood alone, cold, hard, and terrifyingly clear-headed. He had successfully crossed the threshold. The warmth of his past life was gone, replaced by a terrible, organized coldness. He was ready for service. He was an element of the mechanism. 2 days later, Jack, now designated Unit D4, though he still occasionally caught himself thinking the soft, useless remnants of his old name, was deployed on his first perimeter patrol. The experience was revelatory. His new form, lean and rigidly functional, moved with an impossible silent grace. His center of gravity was lower, his joints adapted to absorb shock and propel him forward. He could walk across a carpet of dry gravel without disturbing a single stone, his heavy-duty, newly formed feet pressing the earth with a calculated weight that left no visible impression. His senses were brutally heightened. His vision was no longer dependent on ambient light. He saw heat signatures, pressure changes, and subtle shifts in atmospheric density. He could see the movement of warm air rising off a distant rock face, rendering the environment in a kind of living topographical map. The smell of the forest was no longer a pleasant generalized scent. It was an information stream. The rank odor of skunk was a trivial background noise. The faint, high-frequency whine of stressed metal deep beneath the surface was an urgent alert. He felt no wonder at this change, only efficient appreciation for the new tools at his disposal. The purpose of his existence was now crystal clear. Protection of the perimeter. Everything else was clutter. He covered miles in what felt like minutes, his patrol pattern dictated by the algorithms of erosion and geological stress points, not by existing trails. He reached the upper edge of the territory, near a waterfall known locally for its scenic view. He saw the first target. A lone individual, a young man wearing brightly colored hiking clothes and a large pack, had ignored the flimsy warning signs posted 10 miles back and was sitting on a granite slab, eating a granola bar and gazing down into the distant valley. The Unit D4 stopped in the deep shadow of an ancient cedar, observing. The thought process was immediate and purely logistical. The target posed a low-level threat of informational compromise and a high-level risk of accidental barrier interference. Neutralization was the optimal choice. There was no hatred, no lust for destruction, only the cold necessity of removing an obstruction. Jack made a low, guttural vibration, a warning that resonated through the rock, designed to register in the man's deep ear, triggering an instinctive flight response without providing a discernible source of threat. The man jumped, looking wildly around. He saw nothing but shadows. His human fear pheromones spiked, a sickeningly sweet wave of panic that D4 registered instantly. The man snatched up his pack and fled, stumbling back down the path, fleeing the unseen terror that haunted the air. D4 watched him retreat until the scent of his panic faded into the background noise. Containment achieved. Later that afternoon, he encountered another unit. F7, the individual who had been Sam, was now fully integrated, his form rigid and efficient. F7 was leading a captured human. The captive, a middle-aged woman, wept silently, her hands bound with a tight gray polymer cord. D4 paused, watching the process of integration preparation. F7 moved with mathematical precision, steering the captive towards a subterranean entrance. There was no conversation, no comforting, no cruelty. Just the inexorable movement of the mechanism collecting a new component for analysis. D4 saw his own fate mirrored in the woman's terrified, tear-streaked face and felt only a distant academic interest. The process was sound. As twilight began to filter through the trees, Jack felt a profound shift in the subterranean resonance. The background thrumming intensified, becoming irregular, riddled with sharp, erratic pulses. The internal language of the army shifted from routine status updates to short, clipped, urgent warnings. The air around him grew taut, vibrating with an unseen, massive pressure. The pain he had felt when Grant transferred the memory of the anti-light now pulsed from the Earth itself. Barrier stress level high, integrity compromised. Immediate deployment to Central Sector. D4 moved, his new body responding instantly to the internal command. The casual patrols were over. The army was preparing for something fundamental. The threat they guarded against was pushing back. The breach occurred in a massive, ancient tunnel system beneath the steepest ridge of the quarry, a section that had been sealed centuries ago with packed granite and dense limestone. The army units converged with terrifying speed, flowing into the cavern like liquid gray shadows. The moment D4 arrived, the cavern air was already choked with the intrusion. It was not a creature of flesh and blood, but a terrifying metaphysical event. A wave of anti-light, a phenomenon that devoured heat and sound, was leaking through the ruptured seal. It manifested as a zone of absolute zero illumination and utter silence. A blackness so profound it stole the very possibility of light. When the anti-light touched the rock, the stone did not crack or crumble. It simply ceased to exist, dissolving into a chilling, non-reflective void. The battle that ensued was not a fight. It was a containment procedure. The army moved with the terrifying coordination of a single, massive organism. Units positioned themselves in layered formations, their bodies instantly adapting to the extreme cold of the intrusion zone. The goal was not to defeat the anti-light. It was impossible to fight nothing but to reinforce the surrounding geological structure and physically plug the tear in reality. D4 felt the searing, excruciating pain as the anti-light grazed the edge of his new, toughened tissues. It was not the pain of a cut or a burn. It was the pain of negation. He felt the atoms of his condensed form being stripped away, unmade, leaving behind a cold, raw emptiness. But his training held. His mind, cleansed of sentiment, processed the pain as mere input, a metric indicating proximity to the event horizon. He worked alongside Function G, Grant, hauling immense blocks of quarried basalt, maneuvering them with his redesigned limbs into the perimeter of the breach. The low, resonant thrum of the army was now a desperate, focused shriek. a collective mental effort to hold the structure together. The intrusion intensified. The anti-light expanded, consuming 3 units positioned too close to the edge. They did not scream or struggle. They were simply erased, their absence leaving a cold, clean gap in the line. "The temporary seal is failing," Function G transmitted, the thought pattern sharp and devoid of urgency, despite the critical failure. "Structural collapse imminent. Required immediate terminal function." D4 watched, transfixed by the cold beauty of necessary sacrifice. Function G moved with a terrible finality, shedding the excess weight of his gear. He ran directly toward the growing black void, his body changing even further, thickening, becoming denser, taking on the rigid, angular geometry of raw, processed stone. He reached the epicenter of the breach and threw himself into the tier. Function G was not attempting to close the gap with his strength, but with his pure density. He utilized his final ultimate function, acting as a temporary, living plug. As the anti-light consumed him, Function G's form did not melt. It crystallized. His body absorbed the negation, hardening into a temporary patch of living, dense gray matter, buying the remaining army units precious seconds. There were no last words, no heroic defiance. Only the swift, brutal acceptance of his assigned role. Function G was eliminated, his purpose fulfilled. The sudden, catastrophic loss of a high-level component sent a wave of agonizing psychic feedback through the Army network. D4 was momentarily stunned, but the training immediately took over. The position left by Function G could not remain vacant. D4 moved forward, stepping into the position directly adjacent to the crystallizing remnants of his former guide. He felt the immense, terrifying weight of the dimensional pressure on his shoulder, the anti-light licking at his periphery. He exerted every ounce of his adapted strength, digging his newly hardened feet into the fractured stone, focusing all his purified will on maintaining the line. He felt the cold energy of the army flow into him, reinforcing his mass. His body became impossibly heavy, his limbs locking into the stone, fusing with the mountain. He was no longer standing on the earth. He was becoming part of the perimeter. He was upholding. In the absolute core of his being, there was no room for fear or for grief over Function G. There was only the immense cold pressure of holding the line, the terrifying, necessary function of the army. 2 years. 2 years had cycled through the upper world, bringing 2 seasons of dry heat and 2 seasons of deep snow to the mountains above. Down here, beneath the heavy insulating blanket of rock, time was less distinct, marked only by the shifting pressure of the barrier and the gradual decay of Function G's basalt remnants. The territory was quiet again. The breach had been contained, the structure reinforced with new material and 3 newly integrated silent units. The constant low-frequency resonance that permeated the hive was steady now, a powerful rhythmic beat, like a hydroelectric plant running at optimal capacity, humming deep within the planet's crust. Unit D4, Jack Turner's last designation, was now fully annealed. His memories of human life were not gone, but they were distant, cold reference files. He did not remember the taste of coffee or the sound of his own laughter. He remembered the structural integrity of a rope knot and the optimal caloric intake for cold weather survival. He patrolled the upper slopes, a segment now designated for surface monitoring and interference elimination. His form was hard, lean, and utterly devoid of color, blending seamlessly into the gray, mossy granite. He no longer smelled the forest. He registered the integrity of the perimeter through a complex overlay of scent, vibration, and atmospheric density readings. He reached a vantage point overlooking the old logging road, the same stretch where he had first parked his truck. The sun was pale, filtering through the high pine trees. The world looked fragile, soft, and unbelievably chaotic. Then he saw them. A new group. 6 of them, moving carelessly, their clothes too bright. Neon blues and yellows that screamed human distraction. They were young, laughing too loudly, carrying expensive, flashy gear. They were seeking the legendary abandoned quarry, the one with the strange energy readings, an attraction they had read about on some obscure, frivolous online forum. They were loud. Their movements were jerky, inefficient, and wasteful of energy. They left behind a clear, heavy scent of synthetic detergent, cheap cologne, and thoughtless curiosity. D4 settled against the shadow of a massive, split-open boulder, his body adopting the rough texture of the rock. He watched them approach the overgrown trail he had taken 2 years earlier. A flicker, a residual artifact of the human personality, crossed his internal processing. It was a cold recognition that these bright, oblivious beings were nearing the edge of their shallow, happy world, unaware of the abyssal depth just a few hundred feet beneath their boots. They were potential victims, potential threats, and statistically speaking, potential candidates. D4 pushed off the rock, his movement swift and silent. He did not move as a hunter with a target locked in its sight. He moved as a border guard. His function was containment. He would intercept them, using the low-frequency resonance to trigger confusion and primal fear, pushing them back toward the civilization that sustained them. If they resisted, the process would change. If they showed exceptional resilience, they would be routed for assessment. He took his first silent step onto the mossy earth, leaving no trace. His eyes, now large matte black collectors, saw not the sun-dappled trail, but the underlying structure of the threat vectors. He was Function D4. He was the barrier. And the army never rested.